By the 1880s, the United States was going through major political, social, and economic changes. Industry was growing in scale, and innovations in manufacturing were leading to the production of more goods and services. Factories needed workers, and more workers crowded in the cities, causing conflicts between businesses and workers within these industrial centers. One of these cities was Chicago, home to McCormick Harvester Works. For years, the McCormick family had been locked in a battle with a heavily Irish faction of the factory's workers who were in a union and would often strike over wage cuts. Despite efforts to break union activity at the plant, the McCormicks only succeeded in driving many of the factory's disaffected workers to join outside labor unions. On May 1, 1886, Chicago unions were among those participating in a general strike to limit the workday to 8 hours, in an age where working 10 or more hours a day was commonplace. 2 days later, violence erupted between union and non-union workers at the McCormick factory after union workers discovered those who crossed the picket line had been given the 8-hour workday. During the skirmish, the police intervened, leaving 2 workers dead and others wounded. On May 4th, a mass meeting was scheduled in Chicago's Haymarket Square, a bustling commercial area, to protest the police brutality and the shootings that occurred outside the McCormick factory. Labor activists August Spies and Samuel Fielden, along with the political journalist Albert Parsons, were among those who gave speeches. At around 10:30 that evening, the police demanded that the meeting disperse. In the moments that followed, an unknown person threw a dynamite bomb into the crowd. Many were injured and a policeman was killed. The police retaliated. Shots were fired. Protesters were struck with clubs. By the time the crowd had dispersed minutes later, 73 policemen had been wounded. 6 of them died from injuries. 4 civilians were killed and at least 12 others were wounded. Although the meeting had been peaceful until the explosion, the public blamed the riot on the organized labor movement and on anarchists and socialists. Because both of these groups were largely made up of immigrants, it added to a fear that foreign ideas threatened American values. After an intensive investigation, 8 men were arrested, including Spies, Fielden, and Parsons, and tried for inciting the Haymarket Riot. After a spectacular trial, where it was revealed that some of the men indicted did not even attend the meeting, and it could not be proven which, if any, of the men had built or set off the bomb, all 8 were found guilty and convicted. 4 were executed. In the wake of the Haymarket riots, the labor movement suffered serious setbacks. Membership rapidly dwindled across the country, and for years, anti-union sentiment swept the nation. This event would serve as an example of the powerful tensions between business and workers in the industrial age.
So a short little video there, of course, on the Haymarket affair, which, kind of did set back, of course, labor unions in the country, of course, for a bunch of years before they really kind of started to develop close to the turn of the 20th century. So anyway, I want to welcome you back, of course, to History 2023, American History. Anyway, today, of course, I'm continuing, of course, with another lecture, of course, which will be on a bunch of topics, of course, which will be labor union, like the rise of labor unions, I think is one topic I will talk about. I'll also talk about how the farmers begin to organize the late 19th century. I'll also talk about the rise of populism, which is real big by the 1880s, 1890s. And then I should get up to I'll probably lecture up to 1896 with the presidential election of that year, which was kind of very interesting, which I'll get to later. So look like anybody's watching right now, but if anybody wants to join me, of course, in StreamYard.com, here, of course, is the link below that you see. If anybody has any questions, of course, comments about this lecture, let me know either during the live stream or, of course, later on my, YouTube channel, of course, overall. So Before I get started, I did want to talk about a few announcements, of course, for the week. There should be a bunch of announcements that I do have up that are kind of important that y'all need to know about. There should be a new assignment up that I did put up, by the way. Construction Canvas quiz. Of course, that one is still up. And that one, of course, I think I've got it open till I want to say today and maybe Friday for you to work on. But there's, of course, two assignments right now. The video quiz number one, which is on the Battle of Little Bighorn with George Armstrong Custer. That, of course, is due on Friday as well. And then there's a new Canvas quiz I've got up right now, which is on the Gilded Age, and also on the Old West, which I lectured on the other day. So those are topics which, of course, you can look at, to try to work on to get that assignment done. But it's not due till next week. Okay. So anyway, like I said, we're going to, of course, talk about the rise of labor unions today first, and then I will get into and talk about. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the farmer organizations. Then, like I said, the rise of populism up to the 1880s and 90s overall. So basically, you study about American history more or less at the turn of right after the American Civil War. There was a lack of organized labor. In fact, hardly any kind of labor unions existed going back, before the time of when Abraham Lincoln was president in the 1860s, more or less. And so it's something that you're going to start to see more or less that'll kind of start to develop in the 1860s, 1870s overall. And before the Civil War, there was no real organized labor, pretty much. I'll get to maybe they had some organized labor of some unions like shoemakers or something like that that did exist somewhat. But the actual conditions of most workers, in the 19th century was not that great. They had very low wages. I think skilled labor likely in the 19th century probably made about $20 an hour. Excuse me, $20 a week. I mean, actually, not an hour, $20 a week. I think unskilled was probably half that, like $10 a week, maybe, possibly. So that's kind of an average. So I think skilled labor might make close to $1,000 a year, and maybe unskilled would make like 500 basically a year also. Working conditions were very poor. So, a lot of conditions, especially for coal mining and things like that, were really bad overall. There were no unions, like I said, no kind of health insurance, no workers' comp, none of that kind of stuff existed yet, pretty much with the unions. So that's something you see quite a lot in American history. Early unions that formed mostly due to a lot of labor strife, especially strikes in the United States. Here's, of course, a kind of a list of some examples of major strikes that were big in American history. Like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was supposedly the first real strike that they actually had in the United States. Homestead Strike, 1892, which was one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills that had a strike in Pennsylvania that was kind of bloody. 1886, you saw McCormick had a strike in Chicago, which resulted in a Haymarket affair, as you know, where a bunch of people were killed. The Pullman strike in the 1890s was another one that was also very famous. Now, I'll get to, of course, and talk about some early types of unions that they had in the United States. I'll get to that in a second, but I want to talk about the fact that some of the early labor unions were kind of violent. A lot of these guys organized together. They thought that using violence was one way that they could, get, whatever kind of, more money or wages that they wanted, more working conditions. And one of the best examples of that, of course, was the so-called Molly Maguires, which formed in the mid to late 1800s. And the Molly Maguires, they kind of go back, probably back to that time. It says 1840s, like back in Ireland, but they really started to form in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania in the 1870s. And they're originally called the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And so most of these were anthracite coal miners that kind of formed like a fraternal lodge of men, which was kind of secretive. And they either called the Molly Maguires, or I think some even called Mollies for short, I guess, I believe. They were supposedly named after a woman, hence the name and all that being used. A lot of them launched kind of a campaign of terror against their mine owners and supervisors. They even destroyed mine property. They beat up loyal employees that were against them. And there was a case where they even murdered some workers that were against them and all that. And that kind of created a lot of conflict. And so eventually some of the mine owners hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to come in and break them up, which they did. And so it was kind of this temporary organization to try to fight for coal miners, but you won't really see any organized coal mining until the United Mine Workers Organization kind of starts later, which was formed by John L. Lewis, you may have heard of, which is real big in the United States by the early 1900s. So that's a little later, of course, when that happened. Now, other types of unions they had too, like in the 1800s, there were some unions that started early on that were somewhat successful. There was one that was called the Knights of St. Crispin. It was called, the Knights of St. Crispin. And it was founded in mostly the Northeast. Well, I think it started in Wisconsin originally, like in the 1870s. And it was mostly a union of shoemakers, boot makers, and things like that. And it spread throughout the country, Philadelphia, Boston, New York. And there was even a women's version of it that was called the Daughters of St. Crispin that they had as well. So, and so that was an example of some of the early labor unions that they had. But a lot of the labor unions didn't really work out. I think a lot of those kind of faded over time and weren't successful, especially after a lot of those violent strikes that they, of course, happened and all that. Then you had one of the first major labor unions that formed, which you may have heard of, which was called the Knights of Labor, which formed, I guess, roughly around the 1860s and 1870s. And the Knights of Labor was this type of labor federation, they think, that was formed close to about 1869. That's originally it formed. Had different founders. There was one that was a man named Uriah Stevens, who was a Philadelphian tailor. He helped found it along with some other men. And the idea of this type of labor union was they wanted a type of labor for everybody, for like all workers. So it was like a all-in-one type labor union for skilled and unskilled type labor. And it was very secretive, the Knights of Labor originally, because if employers found out that you were a member of the Knights of Labor, they would fire you. So labor unions weren't legal or anything like that. And so that was obviously a major issue with that. The Knights of Labor, had different ideas that they wanted to do. You can see those are some examples of things that they wanted. They wanted an 8-hour workday. In fact, they were the ones involved in that strike at McCormick's, works there in Chicago, as an example. They wanted workers' cooperatives. They wanted worker-owned factories as well. They wanted to get rid of child labor, which was a problem, in the 19th century, more or less. They wanted more money in circulation, which a lot of these people did. Unions, farmers, etc., wanted more money because money was hard to get, by the way, at that time. They had that long depression going on I told you about at that time. Equal pay for men and women, safety codes in the workplace. I mean, all kinds of things they wanted to do. And you can see all the people that were in it. They wanted anybody skilled, unskilled, men and women, black and white, etc. So they're obviously open to different peoples, more or less, that were American workers. So they want all kinds of things. Now, of course, what happened was the labor union, the Knights of Labor, declined, of course, because of the Haymarket Affair, which has got different names. Some people call it a riot also as well. Remember that video talked about the fact that this happened in May of 1886 because they were striking at McCormick's, works, which were in Chicago because they wanted an 8-hour workday. Happened in what is Haymarket Square, which is in Chicago. Anyway, what happened was the demonstration led to a riot, and there was violence, and somebody threw a bomb, and a bunch of men were killed, including some policemen. And so eventually what happened was a bunch of men were put on trial, and 4 were executed for it. And so after that, people didn't really trust labor unions. They thought they were all violent and all that, or maybe socialist also as well. And so a lot of labor unions would decline after that for a while. Now, the first real successful union, though, that they always talk about is the American Federation of Labor, also called the AFL. And it was founded by Samuel Gompers, who, by the way, was a Dutch Jewish cigar maker who came from London. He came over from to America. He helped create the union itself. The AFL, as it's called. And the AFL was very instrumental in developing a lot of early unions in the United States. They think it was founded in 1886 in Columbus, Ohio. See there. And they think that, if you know much about the National Federation of Labor, it was mostly founded as a craft union alliance, basically, where what they would do is they would divide all the different workers into whatever their craft guild is. So if you're a blacksmith, carpenter, iron molder, painter, plumber, pipe fitter, whatever you were, that would basically bricklayer. They would basically put all these workers into like the same union, the kind of skill that they had, more or less. And the AFL was not like the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was, like a radical organization. AFL was more moderate or more conservative. Gompers preferred to use like walkouts, where the workers would walk out, boycotts, things like that, over violence or bad strikes and things like that. He would try to arbitrate with the employers and things like that. So those are things that they would try to do. The AFL. Later, the AFL, by the way, was, if you know about this, was merged with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, called the CIO, because they started also to organize workers based on industrial unions as well. They work for factories and plants and things like that. That was later. It was founded in 1935, the AFL-CIO, as they called it, which was founded by John L. Lewis. It was that United Mine Workers organization I talked about. He was the head of that too, as well. This all happened later, like I said, in the early 20th century. Because of the AFL, it influenced a lot of employers, federal government and all that, to go to 8-hour workdays, which they pretty much do between the 19th and 20th centuries. They also were one of the first unions to force employers to give workers like workers' compensation, health insurance, things like that. That's stuff that you start seeing later more or less with labor unions. And that'll lead to higher wages and things like that, which start to kind of change when you get more into the 20th century and all that. It takes a while for that to go up over time. So here's more about, of course, the AFL, which is, of course, right there. So you can see their strategies were a lot different compared to, say, the Knights of Labor. So more of a modern approach, not socialist. You notice that right there. Now, this group here, of course, which, of course, is the International Workers of the World. This was, of course, a good example of a type of socialist type union that formed by the early 1900s, a little later, but I guess I'll go ahead and talk about them because they are around. They're still around today. If you want to join the Wobblies, you still can, believe it or not. And the IWW, of course, stood for International Workers of the World. I'll explain why they're called the Wobblies a little bit later in a second, but they're kind of this union that had a lot of different people like socialists in it, communists, even some anarchists also as well. They favored this idea of having one big union for all workers. It doesn't matter what your race is, sex, male or female, etc., skilled or unskilled, doesn't matter. They want those kinds of people, of course, in their union. Also, they were like an anti-capitalist union. They wanted to get rid of capitalism. It was one of their main goals overall. They wanted, you can see there, abolish the wage system is something else that they wanted to do also as well. And they had different leaders. They had, of course, you see there, the two biggest leaders they had of the IWW was William Big Bill Haywood, and of course also Eugene Debs. Those are the two big leaders that were in it. Of course, the other one who's more famous is Eugene Debs, who's a famous American politician and American socialist. He was part of the American Socialist Party. And Debs is famous for not only being involved with the IWW, but he was also involved in some of the strikes, like the Pullman strike, which was in the 1890s, as an example. He also is famous, if you know about this, for running for president 5 times, I think, which is the most ever that any American has ever run for president. Actually, in 1912, he got 6% of the vote as a socialist, which is amazing. I think it's the most a socialist ever gotten in a presidential election. So anyway, who knows what Bernie would have done? I guess if he would have been able to, run, be on the ticket or whatever. But anyway, so that's who Eugene Debs was and all that. He even ran for prison. He was in prison, by the way, in 1920 and still ran for president, which is kind of funny about that one right there. Also, by the way, why were they called the Wobblies? People have always asked me that before about why they're called that. Well, there's, of course, 2 different theories about this. There's one where they think they wobbled because of the fact that there was a joke about the IWW, that IWW stood for I won't work, is what it really meant. Yeah, I won't work, basically. And so they're often known for, if you hired somebody to work for your plan or whatever it was, they'd probably go on strike. That's probably what would end up happening. There's another story where supposedly there was some kind of I think it was a Chinese restaurant where there was a IWW workers would go in there, and the owner of the restaurant, who was Chinese, who didn't speak good English, by the way, would often give them a discount if they were part of IWW. And he would say something like, "Are you with I Wobble Wobble?" I think is what he would say, because he didn't speak English very well. Instead of saying IWW, he would say I Wobble Wobble. And then the name stuck. Wobblies, So that's supposedly where the name came from, which is kind of funny about that. So anyway, so that's the different kinds of unions they had at that point in American history. And I'm next going to move on to talk about also the farmers. The farmers, they're also kind of get involved too with organizing as well in the late 19th century. That's something you see because the farmers feel like they're getting screwed by big business and the railroads, and so they also begin to organize. And one of the first organizations that organized, if you know much about it, is called the Grange. It's called the Grange. The Grange was the social organization of farmers and their families that kind of formed like a fraternal organization, basically to help each other in the community, teach farming methods and things like that. And it was founded in the 1860s by Oliver Hudson Kelley, who had a picture of, I think, previously on that other slide, which is right here. Yeah, there he is, Oliver Hudson Kelley right there. Anyway, this particular organization was kind of angry because of the fact that the railroads were charging them unfair rates to ship their produce to market. They were very unhappy about this. And they had what they call a short haul versus a long haul, where basically if you wanted to ship your produce to, say, a short distance, they would charge you more instead of a long distance, a long haul. They would give people discounts if you were shipping your product like a long way, like a long haul. And so they thought that was unfair, of course. And so that's why a lot of them organized. They also formed, influence in like political state governments and things like that. And so that's something that the Grange was kind of known for, of course, for doing. The Grange, by the way, is still around. It's still around today. I don't think it has as many members as it used to. They believe the Grange influenced later a lot of the farmer alliances I'll get to later that formed throughout the whole United States between different farmers overall. So you can see they were in it for education, socialization, even religion, believe it or not. Yeah, religion. They also formed what they call co-ops or cooperatives to help grow crops and pool resources together, for farming and so on. You can see also that because of the influence of the Grange, they had what they call Granger Laws that were created in a lot of states, especially like in the Midwest and all that. And these were basically laws that regulated railroads, which, like I said, were charging them unfair rates and all that. It was actually backed up by a Supreme Court case called Munn versus Illinois in 1876, which allowed them to eventually do that. However, if you know what happened, it got reversed, which it did. Which they have this another court case called Wabash versus Illinois in 1886, 10 years later, about 10 years later, and it did the opposite, reversed it. It limited the rights of states to control or impede interstate commerce, like with trains and all that. And so that's actually what leads later to what they call the creation of the Interstate Commerce Act, which would be developed afterwards. So that's how it kind of came about, because of how the fact that farmers were being treated bad with shipping products and things like that. So now over time it's going to evolve, like because of the influence of the Grange and farmers organizing. It's going to eventually lead to the rise of what they call the Populist Party, which becomes big by the 1890s in American history. Let me talk about the Interstate Commerce Act. So that came in next because of the Grange movement and its influence in American history. The Interstate Commerce Act was passed basically to regulate interstate commerce, and it was, of course, more geared towards basically trying to regulate the railroads throughout the country. In fact, the farmers wanted the government to take over the railroads, like to nationalize them, things like that, which I think never happened. They did want that. It also set up the Interstate Commerce Commission as well to help regulate it and make sure the railroads and so on follow the laws that were put in it. Those are examples of things that were made illegal for railroads in the Interstate Commerce Act. One, you can see they could not do what they call pooling arrangements. What was that? Pooling is where railroads competed against each other, but set freight rates at agreed upon rates. So they kind of get together and kind of monopolize whatever the rate should be, and everybody would have to pay it, no matter what it is. So they made that illegal. Two, they also made illegal special favors or rates or rebates that they would give to certain customers, especially like some of the maybe companies that are shipping products that are a long way, or maybe certain industrialists like Carnegie or somebody that's shipping a lot of stuff. They'll give them discounts. They can't do that. They have to give everybody the same rate and all that. And I just told you about the long haul versus short haul, that you can't do that either. You have to charge everybody the same rate, no matter the distance, more or less. You can't charge unjust or unreasonable rates as well. Also, you got to print and display your freight rates, what they're going to be, and all that. So those are all things that they did. And so all that kind of stuff, like I said, is illegal, and they basically forced them to regulate that more or less. And of course, Interstate Commerce Act will regulate other things too, highway systems and things like that later on, like they do today. Also with the farmers, another thing they did too, which is famous, a lot of farmers start to get more into what they call farming cooperatives as well, which is well known. So a lot of farmers got together and they began to organize. Well, they did this to kind of create a system to pool their resources and to buy commodities like seed and so on, farming equipment or whatever, to help grow crops. So they could buy. You may have heard like farming co-ops, the tri-co-op, and things like that that exist today. And so you can see farmers began to pool resources, seed, fertilizer, fuel, machinery, even vital agricultural information, things like that to share with each other. And they also work with the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, and they also work with these agricultural extension services, throughout the country to try to help and aid and teach farmers on how to, correctly farm. And you may have heard how, like the LSU Ag Center, which is real big at LSU in Baton Rouge, they have all these different cooperative extension services. Like each county, which is a parish here, has these county agents that can go out and, of course, help farmers out, help them, correctly grow crops and so on. And they're very vital. I actually used to work for the Cooperative Extension Service back in the 1990s. I worked for them, and I actually worked for the 4-H program at one point. And 4-H is something that also kind of developed out of that as well. 4-H is a type of youth organization program, if you know about that, that was kind of associated originally with the USDA, and it's now associated with the LSU, like the ag centers and all that, extension centers, and they help youth learn about farming and raising livestock and things like that, and so they're kind of all part of that whole cooperative farming thing throughout the country as well. So anyway, just kind of talking about, that issue of cooperative farming, that becomes, of course, something that they work to try to, organize overall. Now, another issue I want to talk about as well, that, of course, occurred, the Grange kind of, it's still around, but it kind of began to fail more or less. And the Grange was more like a social thing, I guess, between farmers. And you start to see these political parties kind of form to help out farmers and other groups. So you start getting like the Greenback Party coming out. You start getting the Populist Party that starts coming out also as well. The Greenback Party was something that started after the Civil War. And the Greenback Party was a type of political party that was concerned about the scarcity of money. Money was a real big problem. If you know much about after the Civil War, there was a lack of money. You had even you had that long depression I told you about. It was started in the 1870s roughly. And so there was a lack of money in circulation, which is true. Paper money or whatever, or hard currency like coins. In 1865, the average money in circulation was about $31.18 a person. 1878, it was only $17.08. That's all the money they had in circulation per person in the United States. So that's not a whole lot of money. That was during the so-called Long Depression they had. And anyway, the Greenback Party was a political party that wanted the government to print more paper money, which the government had done during the Civil War under Lincoln's administration. However, what they wanted was the money not backed by gold. If you know about this, they wanted it backed by silver, some kind of non-gold, basically. Farmers were for it. A lot of the silver miners were all for it also as well. A lot of the unions were for it as well. And so it led to the formation of the so-called Greenback Party, which is also, by the way, called sometimes the Greenback Labor Party. They try to get the labor people in it also as well. And the Grange movement kind of formed with it. They kind of joined up with them also as well. They even ran for president, 3 elections, 1876, 1880, and 1884. They actually, in 1880, they actually got 3% of the vote in that election when they ran James B. Weaver for president, who you see on the left, by the way, in that picture. James B. Weaver was one of the early founders of the Greenback Party that was there. And the Greenback Party is kind of important because they kind of influenced the rise of populism, the Populist Party or People's Party, which becomes big in the 1890s. In fact, James B. Weaver joins that too and runs for president again as a member of that party, I think in 1896, I know as well. Let me get more into, of course, the whole money issue, which I wanted to talk about a little bit. Now, in the here's more about the Greenback Party if you want to learn more. It was considered one of the first major, by the way, third political party that, of course, joins up. That and the Populist Party. Those two really considered the first 2 major ones that you have that were considered like a third party. One of the big issues that they start talking about from like the 1870s up to the 1890s is the issue of silver. Silver becomes a big thing, political issue overall. And basically, a lot of people, farmers, like I said, unionists, and so on, miners, all wanted basically silver to be basically either minted or backing paper money, which they call, by the way, cheap money was the term they used for it. And many thought that if the government would just, buy more silver and things like that, that would basically put more money into circulation and all that, and even make silver worth more also as well. And so, but what happened was in the 1870s, several things happened. They had what they call the crime of 73, which you see there. What was that? In 1873, the federal government demonetized silver. They took it out of circulation and all that. They stopped coining like silver coins, more or less. So I think silver wasn't seen as being worth as much. Then they had what they call the Bland-Allison Act in 1878. That was an act that was passed over the veto of Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats passed it. And it limited the silver coinage to 2 to 4 million per month. which was based on a ratio of 16-to-1 ratio of silver to gold. And so they wanted a certain ratio amount, to be printed or backing paper money, more or less. But that wasn't enough. They didn't really work because of the long depression that was going on at the time. And so in the 1890s, they tried to get what they call this Sherman Silver Purchase Act passed in 1890, which was under Benjamin Harris's administration. And that was where the U.S. Treasury must purchase about 4.5 million ounces of silver a month. Government deposited all the silver. They were supposed to put it in circulation, but a lot of it wasn't, if you know about it. And that kind of made a lot of the different, people mad, like farmers, unions and so on weren't happy about it because they didn't really want to do that. It wasn't really, I don't think they really coined too much money in silver. I know that during that period, more or less. So because of the lack of reforms and not wanting to, put silver into circulation as much, it led to the Farmers Alliance, forming together. All these different farmers began forming alliances with each other throughout the country, not just in the North or Midwest, but in the South too. A lot of Southern farmers began forming alliances, Southern Alliance, the Northern Alliance of Farmers. So those are examples right there. I think the Northwest had one too, of alliance of farmers that were also kind of organizing also as well. And a lot of these farmer alliances would have a major influence politically on a lot of state governments from the 1870s up to like the 1890s as a whole. And what did they want? Well, they wanted a lot of things. I'll kind of list here, but the Farmers Alliances, like I said, wanted cheap money backed by silver. That's the big thing, of course, they wanted, which I told you, because they thought that would create more cash in everybody's pocket or money in circulation throughout the country. They also wanted a graduated income tax, which is later the 16th Amendment, as you know. So that's something that they want to try to put in later, although it's more of a progressive movement thing that they get done later, more or less in the early 1900s. They wanted government regulation of the transportation system. They really wanted the government to take over the transportation system, like nationalize like the railroads and things like that. They also wanted into the crop lien system on crops. Like if you wanted to grow cotton and you were a sharecropper, they put a lien on your crop. So you'd have to pay them money later to get credit for it. And because of that, they couldn't get much cash, and so that's something they wanted to also end as well. And they had different leaders that were famous. That were part of the Farmers Alliance. They would eventually lead into the populist movement later. Mary Elizabeth Lease was considered like one of the early leaders of the Farmers Alliances, who would kind of get involved with populism, like in Kansas and the Midwest and all that. She made the famous statement that the farmers needed to raise less corn and more hell, And so she was also involved in a lot of the women's movement, like women's rights movement, like women's suffrage movement to give women the right to vote and things like that as well. So she was heavily involved in that. Also, James B. Weaver was also involved too, as well. A lot of this stuff like in populism later, and he was kind of a big leader too at that time, right here on the left, especially with the populists, more or less. So that leads into the next thing, of course, which is the populist movement, which takes off next, as you know. And so you start to see like 1892, you got the Populist Party that forms in the United States, also called the so-called People's Party. They called it as well. So it's a third political party that forms as a rival to the Democrats and Republicans. like I said, it grew out of the farmers' alliances that were kind of forming all over the country politically. It formed out of the Greenback Party, which kind of started to break up, I guess, around that time. All the pro-silver people, the labor unions are kind of supportive of it as well. And you can see some of the things that they favored right there with that slide. They favored, obviously, an increase in money supply. They wanted that cheap money backed by silver, pretty much graduated income tax. They wanted some kind of federal loan program to help out farmers, like in the country as well, which you won't see till later. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's like the New Deal or something like that. That's something they wanted. They wanted the election of senators by popular vote, which is later, I think, the 17th Amendment. If you know about that, it's something they were for as well. They wanted single terms for president, vice president, only like a 4-year term. They can't have 2 terms. Secret ballot, which is something later that kind of comes about in the progressive age, of course. 8-hour workday, restrictions on immigration to help out people in the country, So they had all kinds of ideas that, were pretty good. And they ran, of course, for presidency a couple times, 1892, 1896, but their best election was really the 1892 election, where James B. Weaver ran for president. His vice president was Tom Watson, I think, was the nominee from Georgia, Thomas Watson. And they polled 1 million votes, like 9-10% of the total vote, which was pretty good. They got 22 electoral votes in the West. So that was pretty good for a third party running at that time in the 19th century. So populism is kind of big up to like the 1896 election that they have. There's of course James B. Weaver that you're looking at right here. And actually, his VP, I'm sorry, it was James G. Field in 1892. And I think in 96 it was Thomas Watson. That's right. I got that reversed. But here's basically like the 1892 election. 1892 election, of course, what happened was Grover Cleveland defeated, he was a Democrat, defeated the incumbent Benjamin Harrison for the presidency. And of course, Grover Cleveland, which we talked about before already, was the only president that's ever served 2 terms inconsecutively. So, because he had been elected before, if you remember correctly, previously in 1884. But you can see, I think that, if you look at that pie here, you can see the area that's in green, what you see right here is the amount that the populace actually got. A little bit. That's a pretty good amount. Like, I think it says 5% of the electoral vote. They got about 9-10% of the actual popular vote. Most of them were in the Midwest, Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho. So a lot of farmers in the West, of course, that voted for. All right, the last thing I need to talk about today, I need to talk about also the 1896 election that they had as well. And prior to that, they had this thing called the Panic of 1893 that occurred, which was a financial panic that happened right after Grover Cleveland was reelected. And of course, a lot of people blamed it on the silver thing, because they kind of started to coin more silver somewhat at that time. And so the federal government decided that they weren't going to do any more silver at all, like none at all. And basically just, back it by a gold standard pretty much. And so silver becomes the main issue, like I said, in the 1896 election. Should we have any silver, basically cheap money, or should we stick with the gold standard? They call it sound money, which a lot of people wanted to have instead. And anyway, if you study about the 1896 election, you had basically these 2 men that ran against each other, which were William Jennings Bryan, who's from Nebraska, Democrat, versus, of course, William McKinley of Ohio, who was a Republican. So those are the 2 that basically ran against each other. Very, very famous election. In fact, one of the most famous elections that happened in the late part of the 1896. Yeah, 1896, there it is, right? There's, of course, the two different sides they had pretty much in the election. On one side, you had the Democrats, were basically the populists, the people, the farmers in the Midwest and the South. They were for all the people that were pro-silver. Some of the labor unions were in support of that side as well. Republicans, it was more like the businessmen and professionals, upper middle class, skilled factory workers, or prosperous farmers, rather than say like people in the Midwest or probably the sharecroppers and things like that. They were part of it. And so those are the different sides of it. Also, one thing about the difference between McKinley. McKinley, you'll see later, was more pro-imperialism. Then William Jennings Bryan is more anti-imperialism. William Jennings Bryan is very famous. He was a great speaker, like great orator, and they called him the Great Commoner. Was one of his nicknames. He was a great lawyer. You may have heard about the fact that he was at one point Secretary of State in the early 1900s under Woodrow Wilson. He also was famous for the 1925 Scopes trial or monkey trial, you remember, which had to do with like theories of evolution, where he was the actual prosecution in the case with Clarence Darrow. He was the defendant attorney that was in it. He was famous for that. He also ran for president 3 times, 1896, 1900, and 1908 as well. So he ran multiple times, of course, for the presidency. Talk about, of course, this particular election, which is very famous. One thing about William Jennings Bryan, he was one of the youngest men to run for president. He was only 36 years old, minimum age 35 to run for president. And William Jennings Bryan is famous for his Cross of Gold speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1896. It practically pretty much gave him the nomination. Before that, he was a dark horse, candidate. Very few people, knew who he was and wanted him to be the nominee and all that. And in that speech, he denounced the bankers and all these industrialists and so on, rich people that wanted to have the gold standard. He favored either like having free silver or bimetallism, where they have gold and silver, which they kind of had before. And of course, he made that famous quote that he's very well known for, where, of course, they got the term Cross of Gold speech for. He said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And of course, that got him the nomination, and all that. However, the election didn't go well like he thought it would. Bryan went all over the country. If you know about this, he traveled all over the country, especially the Midwest, and gave like 600 something speeches, like all over the place in the United States, but still ended up losing to William McKinley in 1896. McKinley, who was from Canton, Ohio, practically just campaigned on his front porch and actually shipped people to him, like with trains or whatever, just brought people over to basically watch him give campaign speeches. It was kind of like what happened in 2020 with Trump, all these campaign speeches all over the country, and Joe Biden mostly just sitting at home, not doing too many speeches. And Biden, I think, raised more money, which was, I think, the key thing of why Biden won, and also why McKinley won, because you can see there that McKinley was able to raise way more, like 10 times more money than Bryan did. He raised like $3.5 million, which is, I think, the most ever at that time for any kind of national campaign for president. More or less, Bryan was like 300,000. You see there, and so that had a lot to do with why it was. Also, McKinley had a very good campaign manager who was Mark Hanna, who's also a politician as well later. he was his campaign manager in 1896 and also in the 1900 presidential election. He was part of why he was successful, because he had a really good campaign manager, more or less. The election, of course, what ended up happening was they think that the presidential election of 1896 caused the Populist Party to collapse after McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan. But they do think that it does kind of influence the rise of the progressive movement, because you'll start to see later, one thing that happens after McKinley, defeated Bryan, he'll run for re-election in 1900. You'll have like the beginning of like U.S. imperialism, where the U.S. goes into Cuba. If you know about that fight in the Spanish, and McKinley ends up putting in his 1900 campaign a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. You've heard about him. Teddy Roosevelt was a pro-progressive guy, if you know about that believed in reforms. McKinley was more of a pro-business guy, of course, and so that's something that's kind of interesting, about those two, the differences between them. Here's the results. You can see 1896 election. You can see how the Solid South, of course, still voting pretty much Democrat with Bryan. You can see the Midwest pretty much went also to the Democrats with Bryan. But you can see all the North, Upper Midwest, Oregon, California, those all, of course, went for McKinley in that election. Now, I will be, of course, talking about McKinley later more. I'll get, of course, into, I think next week we're going to, of course, get into the rise of imperialism, because the U.S. is going to get involved in a lot of imperial conflicts, especially the Spanish-American War, I think, which I'll talk about the most next week. So that's my plan for next week, lecture-wise. We are getting close to an exam, pretty much. I think I want to say by next week I should be able to have our first exam, more or less. It's probably going to be limited in the amount of topic areas. I might limit it maybe to like just 3 lectures or something like that. So it's not going to be as more widespread, my exams, because I do have a Canvas quiz coming up, of course, on the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age on, politics and corruption. And then, of course, we also have the one on the Old West. So that's pretty much I'll test there with that. And then stuff, the remaining period, probably up to, I want to say, close to 1900. I'll have probably an exam on that upcoming later, which I'll announce later, probably at the end of next week, more or less. So before I go, as a reminder, don't forget, you got a bunch of assignments, of course, posted right now. Reconstruction, of course, Canvas, I think it's still up. I think it kind of expires, I think, this week, Thursday, Friday. So try to get that done, that assignment. You got the video quiz on Custer's Last Stand. That's still up as well. So make sure you get that done. And of course, I did post a new Canvas quiz like I was just talking about a second ago. That's on the Gilded Age, dealing with corruption and politics on the late 1800s. And also the American Old West is also included also in that lecture as well. So if y'all have any questions, comments, of course, about this lecture, let me know. I know at the beginning of the video, there was kind of like a little screw up on the stream of it. I'm not sure what happened, but hopefully it doesn't happen again. But let me know if you have any comments, of course, about this lecture or any other lecture before. And y'all have a good weekend coming up. Of course, see y'all later. I'll send a bunch of announcements out about, of course, about these lectures and assignments. So y'all take care. And of course, have a good weekend.